talk about using your strengths to stand out in the college admissions process, even during a pandemic. And I just added that little title there just because it's where we are right now. So I just want to do one quick plug for the GT committee. Every year when we do this presentation in person, we usually sell books and all of the proceeds go towards the GT committee to support it. And so I said I'd be happy to do that as well. The books are $10 and you can arrange with Dory if you want to get one, and all of the proceeds, as I said, will go to the PTC GT committee. All right. So when I was applying to college, back in the day, there was this idea of being a well-rounded student. You wanted to do a lot of different things, and a lot of times we had our hands in a lot of things, but we didn't necessarily go in depth in anything. But now it's really more the idea that times have changed, and colleges want to have, rather than having a well-rounded student, they want to have a well-rounded class, where they bring in students with various backgrounds and unique interests and ways that they can contribute to the college community. So we've really gone from a well-rounded to an angular student body. And of course, this year, things have been very changed because there's increased uncertainty due to COVID. And so what I'm sure a lot of you who are been reading the headlines that are noticing that college applications are up, but not necessarily more students applying, but just students applying to more schools because of the uncertainty. So what can you do about it? What we want to show today is how you can figure out what your strengths are and how you can play to them. And then I'm hoping that you'll find some steps that you can follow to make this process easier and a little bit more enjoyable as you go through it, because hopefully it can be a fun process. So this is the college application wheel. And actually, before I get started, I want to do a quick poll. And Stephanie, if you could just launch that, just so I get a sense of who's in the audience. So if you could just go ahead and figure out, or where you are in those, and just go ahead and answer that, that would be great. All right. Give it another minute or so, if everyone can do that. And then also, while you're doing that, you should all have received a copy of the college application wheel. And if you don't have it for whatever reason, it should have come in your, when you got your confirmation, there should have been an attachment. And Stephanie can put it in the chat if anybody needs it. All right, so it looks like we've got about 88% of the people are parents here, 18% are students. Let's see. We've got, I guess we could go ahead and end the poll. We have about 80% of the people that did it. So you can just share the results, and you can see that we have, a bunch of you have gone through it the first time, but many of you, this is your, I'm sorry, have gone through it before, but this is your first time. So hopefully you'll get some good information here. Most of you are parents, which no surprise there. And we will be recording this. So if you think your students will watch it later, you can. And let me just say where you are in terms of the grades. Stephanie, if you can scroll down, I can't see what that is. Let's see. All right, so most of you are early on, 9th and 10th grade. And so this will be great planning because as we go through this will give you some ideas of how you can think about your high school experience. So thank you guys for filling that out. All right, so let's start with the college application wheel. Hopefully this gave you some time to print out a copy or have a copy on hand. And as I go through it, I'm hoping that you'll be able to add some tidbits and write some notes for yourselves as you go through it. So this is the way colleges, like I said before, they want to see students that can demonstrate excellence in one or two of these areas and go into depth, rather than having every single thing on the wheel. And they don't expect you to have everything on the wheel. But let's start with the first piece of the wheel. So the first piece of the wheel is the academics and test scores. And so all of you students, 9th, 10th graders and even 11th graders are really thinking about your classes for next year. I know I've been meeting with a lot of students, figuring out what would make sense and what are the classes that you want to take. And so what's interesting this year, more than ever, because, and we'll get to the test optional, the most important thing in the academics is really what are the grades, what's the rigor that you're taking, and what's the context. And so what I mean by that is that every school in Westfield has a school profile, and that's a way for them to understand how you fit within the context of your high school. And are you challenging yourself appropriately? And what I mean by that, are you taking classes in your areas of strength? If you think about it, this year, and I know this is a different year, but did you feel like you worked to your full capacity? Did you feel like you were stretched too thin? Did you feel like you had a little bit more bandwidth and that you could push yourself a little further? If you were at the border between sort of A's and B's or B's and C's, did you go in for extra help when you needed it? And I know you can't really go in, but did you set up meetings or Zoom meetings with your teachers or with friends or with did you go on to Khan Academy? So you really want to think about how are you doing in your classes and what's that level of balance for you, because every student's going to have a different breaking point and a different set point. And so that's the thing that you want to think about. And test scores from some schools are becoming less important, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. And so as they become less important, and particularly this year, for the class of 2021, the grades and the transcript were the most important part of the application, because the question that colleges want to answer is, can this student do the work? If we admit this student from an academic standpoint, can they be successful and can they thrive? And the way they make that determination is what you've done in high school over the course of your 4 years. And so I often get the question, is it better to take an honors class and get a B, or to take a regular class or a non-honors class and get an A? And that really depends on where you're trying to go. For some of the larger state schools, it's better to take an honors class and get an A. For some of the schools that are the more select schools, they want to see that you've challenged yourself and that you've taken advantage of all those opportunities. And so there's no one answer that makes sense. Obviously, the flip answer is it's better to take an honors class and get an A, but that's obviously not always the case. As a rule of thumb, if you're taking an honors class and you're getting a B or better, then that's probably an appropriate level for you. If you're struggling to get a C in the class, then that's probably not the right level for you. So each student's going to have that set point for themselves. And then, of course, from a testing standpoint, there's the SAT and the ACT, and either one of them is acceptable. Colleges don't really care which one you take. And so it's really just a matter of identifying what's the best test for you. So for those of you in 10th grade, you'll be able to take the PSAT in April at Westfield. You'll be able to get a sense if that's a good test for you. You can also do another practice test at the end of the year and see which test you prefer, and then focus your efforts on that particular test. So let's talk a little bit about testing. Right now, testing is in flux. Most colleges went test optional for the class of 2021, and many are going to continue for the next 2 to 3 years. The UCs, so the Californias, UCLA, Berkeley, they went test blind for the next 3 years. So what's the difference between test optional and test blind? Test optional means that you have the option of submitting your test. And if you don't submit your test, then they're going to look at other factors to determine if you can do the work and be successful. If it's test blind, you don't have the option of submitting your test. So it's completely based on your academic profile, 100%, even if you got a 36 out of 36 on your ACTs. This year, only 44% of the Common App applicants submitted a test score. So they didn't have a choice other than to look at other ways to make that determination. The College Board also eliminated subject tests and the SAT writing section. So there's a lot less data points for colleges to do. And so just a couple of tidbits to think that the difference between test optional and the schools that really care about it. There's a few schools that decided even before this that they were leaning towards test optional. So a school like Tufts, for example, 57% of their applicants submitted for early decisions submitted a test, and 56% of the admitted students got in who were test optional. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. 57% did not submit a test, and 56% of those students who didn't submit a test got in. So it was pretty equal. Whereas at a school like Georgetown for restrictive early action, they've always liked tests. It's always been a big part of their application. And so only 7.3% of the non-submitters were accepted versus 10.8% overall. So again, it depends on the school and it depends on what they value. But the schools that continue to go test optional for the next 2 to 3 years, you can it's reasonable to assume that they truly are going to look at other factors besides just testing. All right, the next piece of the wheel is extracurricular activities. And this is really anything that you do outside of the classroom. Clubs, activities, community service, work, faith communities, family, story, family responsibilities. This year, a lot of extracurricular activities, if not most of them, got curtailed. And so the question is, how do you spend your time? How are you doing things other than what you would normally do? And so I'll give some examples of that, but I think it's important to recognize that colleges, in the beginning of the pandemic, when we were going on these sessions, they were always saying, we just want people to be healthy. We just want you to stay safe. But later, as we've been in this for a year now, it's been more about, well, we want to understand what you are doing. We don't want to know what you didn't do. We want to know what you did do. And so I think that it's really important to think about other things. And it could be things that you hadn't really thought about doing before. It could be, there's lots of different ways to volunteer. There's a lot of places to volunteer virtually. Food banks need a lot of help. Working in a restaurant, that's another way that students have done things that they hadn't been able to do before. Helping out younger siblings with their homework, that's another way to do it. If you're a musician, doing virtual concerts for seniors. So there's lots of ways you have to think a little bit differently about how you're going to use your time during the pandemic. And the key thing that colleges want to look for is longevity. Are you doing this consistently? And recognizing that you weren't necessarily able to do everything that you were doing for all 4 years, but there might be a theme of something that you've done and that you might have pivoted within that. Are you making an impact? What are you doing to make an impact in your community? I remember one of the admissions people saying that they read a lot of essays about students in the 2020 election who were doing that were calling and doing phone banking. And that was something that you could safely do from home. And they really enjoyed reading about different things that students were doing. And then have you gone deep in those activities? And that's another really important thing, is how deep have you gone in a particular activity? And a lot of times you can have like one activity. So maybe it's soccer or swimming. And then you might be doing that for all 4 years. And then the way that you go deep in that is that you're swimming on the club team, you're swimming on the high school team. Maybe you're teaching swimming to younger kids. Perhaps you're a lifeguard. So there's lots of different ways that that's kind of your overarching theme, and then you can go deep within that activity. The other next piece of the wheel is leadership. And I always want students to really look for everywhere an opportunities to lead. And leadership takes on many forms. You could be a manager, or you could work part-time in a job and have that responsibility of closing a store. I had one student who worked at Boraz, and she was the main, she worked there, and that's not a huge store, and she was often the person that was closing, and she was often the person that was called when the owner wasn't around. And one time she had to go in and clean out and snake out the toilet, and that sounds like a crazy thing, but honestly she wrote her essay about that because she knew that she was the one that people relied on. So that's a form of leadership. You could be obviously captain of a sports team, standing up for something that you believe in. There were lots of opportunities this year with Black Lives Matter for students to find ways that they could speak up for something that they believed in. And a lot of students did that through writing for the newspaper, for going to protests. There was lots of ways for you can take on that leadership. And then mentoring or helping others. And helping others has been a huge one, particularly in this time. We had one student who started collecting food to deliver to seniors in his community. And he started just doing it every week. And he would, get a bunch of people together and deliver the food. And that's a way of showing leadership and making a difference. And then sometimes there's something that's called leadership without a title. And sometimes you want to be a leader and you might run for something and you might not get it. And there was a young man who wanted to be desperately to be a leader in FBLA. And he kept running for positions and he kept losing. And then he decided that, you know what, I'm going to just raise my hand and do things, even if I can't get elected. And then in doing that, he started to gain confidence. And then he found another way to lead by starting his own club that helped refugees. And so he used that failure first to find a way to find his own definition of leadership. So I think there's just different ways to do it. One last example of that, I had a student who's in an a cappella group, and he has a brother with on the autism spectrum. And every year they raise money to support autism awareness. And of course, the concert was scheduled for last April, couldn't do it. And he was very disappointed. He's a sophomore. And he said, look, I asked him, I said, well, could you do it virtually? Is there another way you can do this concert? And it was like a sing off between other a cappella groups in the area. And he said, well, I'm a sophomore. I'm not really I'm not in a leadership role. I'm not the president. I said, well, why not just bring the idea up? And he thought about it and he got really pumped and he said, okay, I'm going to do it. And he ended up bringing together all of the groups. They did a virtual a cappella group. I actually got to listen to it because it was on like Spotify or something like that. And then he even brought in alums of people that used to sing in the group who were in college, and they were able to raise money. So it's just thinking about different ways that you could step up and lead, even if it's not the way that you would normally do it. And the next piece of the wheel is the intellectual curiosity. And your essays are a really great way to demonstrate this. And there, I've just put a lot of different opportunities there. But think about things that you like to do just because you like to do it, not because you have to do it for class. Do you like to write? Are you interested in history, science, the stock market, computer programming? I mean, there's lots of different ways that you can demonstrate your curiosity. I had one student this year who was interested in poetry. He was the type of kid who was always thinking about words, and the words would kind of form in his head, and then he would figure out ways to bring them together and form poetry. And then he started a blog because he wanted to share his use poetry as a way to express himself and make sense of the world. And so that's a way of showing leadership. Even though he wasn't doing it with a lot of people, it was a way of intellectual curiosity and leadership, because it was a way of him using his intellectual curiosity to make an impact. I had another student this year who was really interested in science, and in particular wanted to do biomedical engineering. And I asked him, I said, well, how did you get interested in that? And he wrote an essay about wanting to make artificial limbs. And I said, well, how did that come about? He said, well, do you want to know the truth? I said, yeah, I do. He said, well, I was watching an episode of Grey's Anatomy, and I saw that they were making these, artificial transplant organs for transplants with a 3D printer. And I thought, oh my God, that's crazy. Like, is that something you can actually do? So we ended up going and figuring out that you could actually do that. And that's what biomedical engineers do. And that's what led him to his interest in that. So there's lots of ways that you can demonstrate your intellectual curiosity. A lot of kids will do some pre-college programs over the summer. They might be very involved in the arts, or they might really like film and get really into that. Students who are into statistics often will do fantasy football leagues or other sports leagues and use that prowess. I had another student this year who wrote about playing Settlers of Catan and how he loved the economic and the strategy and finding ways to figure out how to use those resources. And these are all things that demonstrate your intellectual curiosity. And it's just a matter of figuring out what those things are for you. So I want to give you a case study right now, and and I do want to preface this. I have 4 case studies here, and I pulled case studies from this year's class because I wanted to show the pandemic at work here, because a lot of you might say, well, I can't do this, it's a pandemic. So I just wanted to show you how students were able to manage through the pandemic and still be able to use their strengths to stand out. So this is Barry. I call him the devil's advocate, politically active swimmer. So Barry had a 3.64 GPA out of 4, weighted GPA. That put him in the top 50% of his high school class. And I want you to get familiar with that terminology, because a lot of colleges will use the terminology top 10%, top 25%, top 50% when they're talking about whom they admit. So he was in the top 50% of his class. He had a few C's on his transcript, but I wanted again to show you that doesn't mean that that's a death knell. He took a rigorous course load. He had 11 AP honors classes. He had 13 40s on his SATs. Barry was a really strong leader. He was involved with Teens for Teens, which is a local organization, which you may be familiar with, that is teen run, and it focuses on raising money to help teen related organizations and teens in need. So the gala is typically in April. And so, of course, we all know what happened last year. They were planning the gala and they kept postponing it. And they said, oh, we'll do it in May, we'll do it in June. And Barry realized very quickly that it wasn't happening in May, it wasn't happening in June. And nobody else on the committee wanted to accept or admit that. And he kind of stood up and said, you know what? We have to we have to pivot. We can't, it's not going to happen. So we have to make this a virtual auction online. And so he got everyone was in agreement, and they just needed someone to step up and say it and, cast the gauntlet. And that's what he did. And they were still able to raise money, and they were still able to have it, albeit not the gala, but they were still able to do what they needed to do, which was they had already secured all of the auctions, and they would do it virtually. And they're doing the same thing this year. They're making it a virtual auction. Barry was also a really strong athlete. He was a 4-year varsity swimmer, and he did club swimming. He was pretty much swimming all the time. He was the first junior to make captain of his high school. And he was also a lifeguard and a swim instructor. And on top of that, he also was teaching how students teaching other lifeguards CPR training. And in fact, I just was chatting with his mom, and she said he's still doing that right now. So he continued to do that. And then the other piece that was really strong was his intellectual curiosity. He was very involved in Model UN. He had a strong interest in politics and international relations. He really enjoys debating and learning different perspectives, and playing devil's advocate, actually, especially in his Lebanese grandfather's working class bar, the working class pub. His grandfather owns a bar in central Pennsylvania. He spent a lot of time there. He got to know all of the patrons there. And one of his favorite things to do was just to listen to them and understand. And as he calls it, Trump town, Trump world. And during the election, it was a very interesting conversations that he would have with them. And he would try to understand them. They would try to understand him. And he said, look, they're never going to change. I'm never going to change. But I love listening and playing devil's advocate and trying to understand all different perspectives. He went to Lebanon when he was a few years ago, and he had these great stories from his family about Lebanon. And when he went there, felt like a very different Lebanon than what he'd heard about. And that got him really interested in international relations and how he can make an impact. And so that's really what drove his academic interest. And so let's talk about our strategy for Barry. So with Barry, we wanted to identify a list of schools with strong international relations and politics that was located near a city, because he really wanted to be in a big city. He wanted, on his application, he focused his intellectual curiosity and his desire to understand multiple perspectives and his leadership. So those were the things that we wanted to emphasize. His first choice was to be in Washington, D.C., surrounded by a diverse student body. And he really liked George Washington after he visited everything. So the strategy was for him to apply early decision to George Washington. This was his initial list of schools. And so he had a good range of reach, possible, likely, and safety schools. And I always recommend that you have a good mix of schools. And this year in particular, and I'm assuming next year as well, the uncertainty will continue, and people will apply to more schools, and that will unfortunately just be the case as things remain test optional. And Barry he applied and he was accepted early decision to George Washington. So that is a perfect place for him, and he's excited to go there. All right, so I want you to take a minute and just think about what your wheel looks like. I'm also going to stop and see if there's any questions that anybody has. And think about where you want to focus your energy, or I know there were mostly parents here, but you might think about where your kid could, for the kids that are here, think about where you want to, if there are some goals you want to set from yourself. Think about, do you have your own, tutoring company, snow blowing, lawn mowing? Those are all businesses that students can start even in the pandemic. Was there something that you always wish that you could do, but you didn't have the time? Think about what are the things that energize you and what are the things that deplete you. And I think one of the benefit of COVID is that you have that time to think about it, and then to think about when God willing, things open up and come back to normal, where do you want to spend your time, and where do you want to, what are the things that are going to energize you? I'm going to just take a quick look to see if there's any questions. Are there any questions? No? Okay. Let's see if Stephanie has any questions for me.
I don't have any questions, but a participant raised his hand, and we just encourage you, if you have a question, if you could just write it in the Q&A box.
Yes, if somebody has a question, they want to unmute themselves and ask it, you can do that as well. Now's the time. Okay, then I'm going to go ahead and continue. Okay, The next piece of the wheel is other and also character. And I actually added character this year uh, as part of the other more distinctly because it really became even more important. It's always been important, but it's become even more important this year because, as I said before, with less ways for colleges to understand people and figure out if they're going to be a good fit, the character became a huge part of the application. And some things also just the other that don't really fit neatly into your application. So it could be these personal qualities, kindness, compassion, resiliency, grit. All of these things are considered non-cognitive factors, and they're all things that help students be successful in college. Those are all the other things. If your legacy, so if you are applying to a school that cares about legacy, so a school where one of your parents went to school, and usually if they went to college there, then that can be an other, and that can make a difference as well. Of course, provided that you are academically in the range. First generation low income students, that's an other. Underrepresented minorities is an other. Geographic diversity, New Jersey is the biggest exporter of students, particularly within a 4 to 6 hour drive. But if there are other places that you would go that where not as many students go from your particular geographic area, that could be an other. And then if you're interested in a field that's typically popular with an opposite gender, so a male interested in nursing or a girl interested in computer science, although more and more girls are getting interested in computer science, but the gap is still wider there. So those are ways where you can have that other piece. Um, the other thing to think about is if you've overcome an adversity, and a lot of times you will put that into your additional information section on the Common Application. So I had an example of a student who had some medical issues when she was younger, and she was out of school for a while, and it set her back. And then she had another incident her beginning of her sophomore year of high school. And then that also impacted her grades. And so when she was applying to a school that only looked at the numbers, they weren't able to get a sense of that other and what she overcame, even though she wrote about it in her main essay. And so we actually had to put in an appeal to show how she had overcome all of this adversity and how she improved her learning and the steps that she went to demonstrate that she was going to be a successful. And in fact, she talked about how because she had gone through all of this adversity, it makes her an even stronger and more resilient student and will be even more successful. So those are the things that would be other and character. So let me move
Oh,
to,
Lisa, there's two questions for you.
okay, sure. What are they?
One's a quick one.
Yeah.
Someone wanted to know if Barry received any financial support from GW as an early decision applicant.
He did not. And he did not because for a number of things. Well, first of all, he would have had, and I'll get to them when we talk about financial. So Barry was not at the top of the GW incoming class, where if you recall, for Barry, I had put that as a possible. So if he had been at the top of GW's class, he probably would have gotten some merit money. He didn't have a financial need, but he might have gotten some merit money. But because he wasn't at the top of the class, they accepted him as a full pay student.
And then one more question. Do you encourage your students to focus on just one part of the wheel more heavily than others, or touch on all of them?
I encourage my students to find the pieces of the wheel that that most reflect them. So I don't expect everyone to have every piece of the wheel. And as we go through the studies, you'll see the case studies, you'll see how that plays out. It's really important to identify what are your pieces of the wheel. What are the things that are really your strengths? You might touch on everything, but not all of those things are going to be a strength. So some students know right away that like, yeah, I'm not an athlete. That's not going to be a strength of mine. Or, I can't sing at all. So that's not going to be, I don't have a special talent. And I'll show you as we go into those pieces of the wheel. So it's really important. And sometimes we see crossover, and I'll show you how that works too. So for example, with Barry, we saw some crossover with community service and leadership. So he had those two things going on together. And even he developed leadership within his athletics. But you could see that most of it was around his, leadership was a thread, and then it was the service and athletics and intellectual curiosity. So you're not going to have all the pieces of the wheel. It's really hard to do all of those things and go deep in them. Okay. All right, so let's move back to Bronwyn. Okay, so Bronwyn, I call her the compassionate, creative, quiet leader. So Bronwyn had a 3.85 out of 4 unweighted GPA. Her school did not weight her classes. She had a rigorous curriculum, 15 AP honors classes. Her SATs were not were solid, but they weren't as strong as her grades. So she had a 1250 on her SATs, and she went to a girls' private high school. She had a special talent, which was in a lot of ways I don't want to say it was undiscovered, but it was something that she kind of kept secret. I mean, she liked to do, it was more of a talent that she liked to do video editing, and she would do it for fun. But I'll show you how it played into her wheel, is that she ended up using that talent to create a campaign video to get elected to the executive board. Bronwyn had a great character. I mean, she was really a wonderful young woman. But interestingly, she began her high school feeling insecure, which many kids do. She hadn't really figured out what she was all about yet, and she also was an overthinker, and so that led to her insecurity. And interestingly, and this sounds a little cliche, but it's true in her case, the more she focused on helping others, the more confident she became, and the less she thought about herself. So she stopped thinking about, oh, is someone going to think that I'm weird, or they're going to, she started thinking about other people and put the focus on others rather than herself. And when COVID was canceled, it actually worked to her benefit, because she was planning on doing a program where she would go away and do some volunteer work, which she had done she'd gone to a church work camp for the past 2 summers. But when that changed, she obviously couldn't go away. So she looked for some local opportunities to give back. And the other way that COVID actually worked to her benefit was that when she was in high school, she was always wanting to be part of this executive board of her high school. It's a really big deal at her high school. She always looked up to those girls. She always, imagined that she could be one of them one day. And she had run for some things but didn't win. And then she started, overthinking it. But then when she got the announcement that they weren't going to be able to do their speeches in person, they were going to have to make a video, her initial reaction was, oh, forget it, I'm not going to run. And then she thought about it, and she's like, well, wait a second. Actually, I'm good at making videos. And so she just said, I'm going to have fun with it. And she created a video a la Dance Moms, like Abby, and she put in all the things that all her friends, she knew her friends liked. And she used that to showcase her leadership and her humor. And lo and behold, she won. So she became elected an executive board member. She was also involved in Girl Scouts, even though she didn't go through to her gold award. And then over the summer, that local opportunity that she found was to work at St. Joseph's, or to volunteer at St. Joseph's Social Service Center, and to volunteer serving food to the homeless. And that, of course, as we all know, is such a huge need right now. And when she was there, she would do it probably 3 or 4 times a week during the summer. And she would see the same families. And then one day she saw a teenager, a girl her same age, and she kind of, poked to her friend, and she said, "Who's that?" And they said who she was. And she was so taken aback that someone her own age was homeless and was seeking food, that it made her start thinking about food insecurity and how does it happen. And she got really interested in that topic. So I actually should have put intellectual curiosity. It sparked her intellectual curiosity about that. And then she was also in the Peer Ministry Club and the church work camps over the summer. So Bronwyn really emerged in the last couple of years. So for our strategy, it changed really because of COVID. So originally she was thinking she wanted to do something in pre-health or business. And so pre-pandemic, she planned on volunteering at a hospital or doing the church program, church mission program, work summer program, but instead she volunteered at the food bank over the summer. As she learned about food insecurity and became a more confident leader, her interests really shifted to business. And so she was really clear about that. So we ended up refocusing on colleges with a strong commitment to service and business programs. And Boston College emerged as her top choice. And that really aligns with who she is as a person and their own mission. So this was her list of schools. Now, another interesting thing is that originally I had Boston College and Villanova as reach schools for her. And primarily it was because her test scores were lower. They were outside of the mid 50 percentile range for Boston College. But because everything became test optional, she didn't submit her tests and her academics were really strong. So lo and behold, she was accepted early decision to Boston College, and it's like a great fit for her, and I'm really excited for her. So that was an interesting way how COVID actually changed her trajectory and what she was doing. All right. Any questions on that?
Yeah, Lisa, there's a few great follow-up questions for Barry,
Sure.
and then another general
Oh, for Barry.
question that is
Okay,
very
sure.
important to hear. So
Okay.
one of the follow-up questions for Barry is, do you think Teen for Teen for Barry in raising funds was key in his story and his acceptance to GW?
That's interesting. He didn't really, I mean, Teens for Teens was certainly a strong leadership role for him. But he didn't really talk about Teens for Teens at all in his application, other than outlining it in his activities and in his resume. He explained what he did, but it was not a large part of his application. His application was really about, and that's interesting for GW because one of their supplemental questions is describe a time when you've talked to somebody, something like somebody who was different than you or had a difficult conversation, and how did that go? Did you sort of change their mind or not? And he originally wrote an essay for that about working in his grandfather's bar and the differences there. And it was such a great essay. It was so authentic, and I just really heard his voice. And I was like, you know what, this should be your main essay. So we made that his main essay. And that was really what GW was looking for, was students, particularly for the program he wanted, which was international affairs, was students who had a really strong understanding of and openness to different perspectives. So I'm not going to say that Teens for Teens wasn't something that they saw and they thought, wow, he's made a big difference, but it wasn't central to his story in the narrative of his application.
The next question is, do you recommend revealing information about learning differences in the additional information section?
I do, if it makes sense, and if it's adding some context, because remember, everything that colleges, when they're looking at, they want to understand contextually where the student is coming from. So the one student that I alluded to, she had some learning differences that stemmed from her medical condition, and we addressed it, but we didn't go into as much depth as perhaps we should have, because I didn't realize the full extent of it. And then when we had to go to the appeal, we just laid it out on the table. We wrote everything that happened, when it happened, how it impacted her, how she learned from it, how she changed the way that she approached her learning. And that's what made the difference. And I normally would always recommend that students do that if it impacted their grades and there's something to explain. They're not going to hold it against you. The thing with learning differences is they want to understand that the student is aware of what their learning difference is, that the student can be a self-advocate, that the student understands how to manage their learning difference, and that the school can support it. And that's really it. So it's not going to ever be a knock against a student. It's just a way for them to understand contextually what that student has gone through.
Two more great questions. So
Yes.
one is a follow-up to the person who asked about Barry and financial aid. So is it your experience that the Reach schools will accept students they normally wouldn't accept unless they are willing to pay full price, because the EDs essentially require students to accept?
Um, that is not that that is not my, well, let me put that on the table until we get to the financial aid piece, and then I'll explain, because it's not a all or nothing, and I want to explain that. So let me just move through and quickly go through the athletics, and then we're going to get to the financial piece and I'll talk about that. Okay. So for athletes, the questions that you want to understand and how that, if that is a really big piece of your wheel. And for most of the recruited athletes, it's going to be the main piece of your wheel. You might have one other thing that you're doing, but if to be a committed athlete and to be a recruitable athlete, you're spending almost all of your time doing athletics. So as far as the athletic piece of the wheel, you want to understand how to balance athletics and academics. You want to know going in, do you want to be recruited or is it more recreational? And then if you do want to be recruited, what level? Is it going to be Division I, where you're more athlete first, student second, or Division III, where you're student first, athlete second, and Division II is closer to a D1. And then also plan for injuries, because you don't want to go to a school where, God forbid, you get injured and then you're not going to be happy to be there. So let's look at Jocelyn. I call her the bilingual musical pre-med fencer. So Jocelyn had a very rigorous academic curriculum. She was in the top 30% of her high school, and she had a very strong ACT, so 34 on her ACT. She was also very strong intellectually curious. She was interested in becoming a doctor. Her father was a doctor, is a doctor, and they would often, she's an only child, so often their conversations at the dinner table from when she was a young girl revolved around, talking about cases and her trying to diagnose them. So she was always very interested in science. She was also interested in French because she had some family that lived in France. And so she would often visit them over the summer, and wanted to get fluent in French. As you can see, athletics is a big piece of her wheel, and leadership, because she was a recruited fencer. She was nationally ranked. She was the captain of her high school fencing team. She was also part of the club fencing team, which is often even more relevant for that sport. She, during the pandemic, she wasn't able to train. And so she realized that if she wasn't able to train, then other people probably wouldn't be able to train either. So she took it upon herself to create a series of videos to help other athletes that were home using, household items to figure out how they could keep up with their training regimen. And then she used that. So that's really a form of leadership to help other people as well and to stay physically fit. And she also had a strong character in community service during the pandemic, and even pre and post the pandemic. She worked at a food bank that was serving a large Haitian population, and she was able to use her French to connect with the families. So for Jocelyn's strategy, we wanted to identify a list of colleges with a strong pre-med program. And originally we thought D1, D3. We weren't sure who would be interested. And so you'll see when I show you her list, we had a lot of schools on there that were reaches, because oftentimes the athletic piece can pull you in. So from an athletic perspective, you want to reach out to coaches and communicate in an ongoing way with them with the goal of being a recruited athlete. You want to, if you can, attend college showcases. She did this pre-pandemic, and she was fortunate because she'd already received national ranking before she applied. And then she continued to train during the pandemic. She also got a pre-read from admissions and coaches support, and that was really critical. And she had ongoing communication with her coach, and he was really at NYU. Other coaches showed a little bit of interest, but at the end of the day, NYU was the main school that was interested in her. And so she was going to apply early decision to NYU. And they kept coming back and saying, oh, well, would you consider doing this program or doing the College of Liberal Studies? And she was always open to whatever they wanted her to do. So you can see that we had a lot of reach schools, and some of those were because we thought if a fencing coach was interested, she might get in, and some of them were just because she wanted to put them on the list, and that was fine. And then she ended up applying and getting accepted early to NYU. But what I will say is that she also got into Rutgers because she found that out before. And she had all of her applications ready to submit. I do recommend that for athletes, even though 95% of the time you're going to get in if you have the letter of support from the coach, but there's always a chance that it doesn't work out. And so it's always a good idea to have all of your applications ready to submit. And so she did, but we ended up not applying, or she withdrew them. So now let's talk about the financial piece, and I'm going to come back to that question. So I think the question was, is it your contention that reach schools will not give money because they think that you're going to come anyway? So it really depends on what type of money you're talking about and how that works. So Schools that meet full financial needs. So those are schools that will meet a student's demonstrated need based on their financial, um, based on their finances, their ability to pay. Those schools will not discriminate early decision. If a student needs money to go and they apply early decision, they will meet that full need. And I've had students who I've worked with, and they've had this fear that if they have a financial need and they apply early decision, that they're not going to get in with the money that they need because they know they want to come. And that's not the case for a school that meets that full need, and those are typically the most select schools, all of the Ivies, WashU, Emory, UVA, UNC are the only out-of-state schools that meet full need for out-of-state students. But there's a whole list, and you can Google what that list is. But those schools will 100% meet that full need for early decision candidates. For merit money, which is what I think we were talking about for GW, that also depends on the school. Some schools will give some money for a merit if you apply early decision, but a school like Tulane, which is known for giving a lot of merit money, has said that, if we know you're applying early decision, we're not going to, and you're better off applying early action because you would get more merit money if you did early action. But then the flip side of that is those schools like a Tulane is also notorious for waitlisting or deferring students that are too high for their profile that they don't think they can actually admit. So there's a term that is called yieldability. And so many colleges, and you'll see that where a student who's really, really strong gets deferred or waitlisted as school, that school believes they're using as a safety school. And so they want to make sure that student is going to be yieldable. So that's a newish term, yieldability. So in the example of GW, if that student had a financial need, then he would have received money, regardless of if he applied early decision. But because he wasn't at the top of their incoming pool, he wouldn't have received merit money. And I don't know that he would have received merit money regardless. And so that would be a school that would be need aware. And so a need aware school means that they will look at students, all things being equal, they'll do their best to accept need blind. But then when it comes to the end, when they're shaping the class, they might look at those students and see how their budget plays out. And then they will accept students that are full pay. So hopefully I answered your question. And one of the things that you want to think about when you're having this conversation with your, as a family is, know what your budget is. And how will that inform the list of schools? It's really important to know for a student to know what your budget is so that they know if you get into the school, you can go if you get merit money or if they meet our full need. And if they don't, then you can't go there and you'll have to go to a school that's within our budget. So that's a really important conversation to have. And I always recommend you do that before you apply and before you put your list of schools together. Any other questions on that? No? Okay, great. So now let's move on to special talents. So special talents are things that are very valuable to colleges because it's ways that they can contribute again to the college community. If you're an international chemistry award, that's the way you're going to be able to contribute in the research facility. If you're a published writer or a dancer, or if you write for the newspaper, then that means that they have students that are going to write for their newspaper. If you're in the marching band, you can join. And if a school has a marching band, then they always need students to be able to play in their ensembles, dance in their dance teams. All of those areas need to be filled. And that's where that special talent can come into play. And many colleges have what's called an art supplement where you can submit an example, and they usually will send that to a professor or to the conductor to see if that's something that they can use within their university. So this is the last case study I want to show you is Kelly. Kelly is I call her the innovative kind bridge between math and art. So Kelly had an outstanding academic record. She was in the top 5% of her high school. She had 19 AP and honors classes. Her SATs were solid, but they were not commensurate with her grades because she was also 2 years ahead in math. She had a really strong intellectual curiosity and leadership. She was the captain and leader for Teams Club, which at her school was technology, engineering, math, and science. And they placed first in their state. She was part of the Science Olympiad. Over the summer, she took a class at Stanford. She was interested in really a deep artist, but also really interested in engineering. And so she wanted to take a class over the summer to confirm that interest in engineering. And she was able to find a visual thinking mechanical engineering course, which was right up her alley. She also, previous to that summer, had spent her 3 previous summers taking art classes at the Maryland Institute of College Art. And then she was involved in a bunch of other activities. She had a really strong special talent. Like I said, she was a talented artist. She'd won numerous scholastic gold medals, including Best in Show. She danced since she was 3 years old. And she did submit and she was able to continue dancing, which a lot of kids have been able to do during the pandemic. You're just doing it on Zoom. And then she submitted an arts portfolio. Um, and I think all of those things are 100% amazing. But I think what really helped Kelly stand out was in that other category. Um, During the pandemic, Kelly had a neighbor who was a cancer survivor, and she knew how important it was for the healthcare professionals to be protected, and saw that there were no PPEs at the start of the pandemic. So she had heard of another boy who had used a 3D printer to make PPEs, and she wanted to do the same. So she approached her high school and asked if she could use their 3D printer. They said, no, you can't, because I guess they didn't want people in the school. So she bought all of the pieces to create a 3D printer in her house. She got all of the materials, and then she started having a little manufacturing site in her room. And she's still doing this now. She's making PPEs for her local hospitals. When she was in the class at Stanford, she had to come up with a problem to solve. And she had a brother who's on the autism spectrum, but very high functioning, really smart, but had trouble paying attention, and often would get letters home saying that he needed to pay more attention. And she noticed that when he really responded to touch. So she wanted to create a device that could be used by teachers, that was innocuous, that looked like a bracelet or looked like a watch, so that kids wouldn't get made fun of, but that the teacher could push a little button that would activate some sort of vibration to get the student to pay attention and to focus. And she called it the Hocus Focus. And she created this product to be beautiful, because that's what she was. She was always a math person and an art person, and she always brought those two things together. And she was also legacy at Dartmouth. And so and in her, at one of the supplement essays for Dartmouth, she talked about why she loved math and how she loved the visual side of it, and how she was always the one in the class, because she was so far ahead, that some of the kids and I hate to say it, but a lot of times they were boys, and they would spend all of the time trying to solve the equations, and she would look at it and it would just see a visual way to solve the problem, and then she would love sharing it with other people in the class. So she really had that bridge between math and art. So if someone had asked about one talent or not, some kids find ways to combine it, and then that becomes their angle, is kind of that special talent and intellectual curiosity. So Kelly was involved, in a ton of activities, and as a freshman. But by junior year, her talents had really blossomed and into math, engineering, and art. And they blossomed through teams, her summer classes, and her own interests. We wanted to identify a school that would allow her to explore her STEAM interests broadly and deeply, and focus on her application on how she merged her visual thinking and her math skills to solve problems. And of course, she was going to apply at ED. And this was another instance where test optional really paid off for Dartmouth. And so this was her list of schools. She had, a very deep list, and she applied early and was accepted to Dartmouth. So I was very excited, because she did not have any of their applications done, but she did get into University of Delaware. And in that instance, because she was at the top of their class, she did get some merit aid for that school, but it was not early decision, it was early action. All right, so now I want to open it up to questions. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, so 2 questions that we have for you, Lisa. One,
Okay.
all of these examples are of exceptionally high performers. How do students that are average across the board or only have one strength across the wheel improve their profile so that they are competitive?
Yeah, so I think all of them seem like they were really, high profile, because we found those areas of strength that they were really, really strong in. So I think it's to figure out, what are the things that get you as a student or as a parent, what are the things that get your student excited, and then to go deep in those things and just explore those things. You don't have to do everything, but if there's one area where you can get really excited about it, and you can talk about it in a way that they feel your excitement, then that's really how you can do it. I mean, if you go back to Bronwyn, I mean, she had wasn't really that confident in her earlier years. I mean, she was a good student, she was a strong student, but she didn't really know where she was going to go, until she started, helping out and doing more community service, and realizing that she could use her strength, something that she didn't even really think of making videos. But then she found a way to use that video editing to share who she was as a person. So sometimes it's the things that you don't even realize that you might take for granted, that you don't think are a big deal, but actually are something that is your strength. Any other questions?
Yeah, one more question. This was a follow-up to something to another question I answered in the Q&A, and this individual was curious about what schools, the highly selective schools, were looking for a lot of AP courses, and that was something that was very important to them. But then she asked, what about larger state schools? How do they
Yeah,
feel about AP courses?
so it really depends on the large state schools. So a school like Indiana, even Michigan to some degree, Wisconsin, Maryland, Delaware, they are not as focused on having every class at the AP honors level, and you're going to do better getting better grades and not taking that. Schools like UVA, University of Virginia, and University of North Carolina, for an out-of-state student, and Texas, they are going to want to see rigor, and they're going to want to see students. So it depends on the state school. And Rutgers, if you want to be in the honors college, then obviously you need to have a lot of rigor. But if not, then it's not necessary to get in.
And then one more question. Kelly seems amazing. Why are those schools reach schools? Is there an applicant for whom those wouldn't be reach schools?
Yeah, and I should have prefaced it by saying that those are wild cards, meaning that they're just highly select. So for anyone, I would put them in as a wild card. That she's absolutely admissible, and I knew she was going to get into Dartmouth because she just was such an amazing young woman. But in another year, those 1340s on her SATs, that would have been a problem, right, for some of those schools, because there might have been someone else just as amazing who had higher test scores. So this year that really helped her because she didn't have to. So they put all of the energy on everything else that she did. And I do think that they would have probably overlooked that, because she was such she is a remarkable young woman.
Do we have time for a few more questions? A lot of great questions are coming in. Or
I'm fine. If people want to stay on, I'm fine to answer for another few questions. So maybe we'll take four more questions.
okay, so great. How important is legacy in pushing a kid over the edge?
Uh, so if a student is strong and is admissible, right, and has all the other things, then it definitely will make a difference. So even with Kelly, she had legacy at Dartmouth. So you'd think Kelly would have gotten in regardless because she's such a remarkable young woman, but having that legacy just made it a shoo-in. Even when we were looking at the numbers, I think 15% of the applicants that were accepted early decision to Dartmouth this year were legacy.
Great. And last two questions. In the case of the Kabylie, this is another follow-up with the
Yeah.
financial aid, same individual. In the case of the Kabillionaire families, they should know that you are essentially saying that the Reach Early Decision schools will financially support those families who can't afford the school but are academically a reach. In my case, because my kid has Kabillionaire parents, no financial support is available in an early decision situation. Do I have that right?
Um, Early decision or otherwise, if you do not have a financial need, then you would not receive any financial aid that was need based. And most of the school, the vast majority, not all of them, but most of the schools that meet full need often do not give merit aid. So then yes, that would probably be the answer.
And then all of your case studies applied ED. Was there any change to the recommended strategy and outcomes for ED for this current class of 2021? What do you anticipate for the class of 2022?
Yes, and you might have missed my earlier disclaimer is I purposely chose early decision cases just because those were the ones that I had information for the class of 2021 who had gone through the pandemic. We did recommend that students applied ED when it made sense for them because we knew that colleges with the uncertainty were looking for ways that they could manage their enrollment. And so for the most part, that worked. But we, like everyone else, also decided to do early decision or restrictive early action. And so, in the case where so many applications were submitted, there were a number of deferrals this year because, like Harvard applications, it wasn't ED, it was EA, but that went up 57%. MIT went up 62%. So, there were cases where it didn't work, but fortunately, in many cases it did. The early decision absolutely worked. And as far as going forward, we will recommend again for students where it makes sense, probably to apply early decision to that possible school. So the school where they're in the range, or maybe they're just a little bit below, but not a school that's completely out of reach. Because for those schools, it's not gonna help because everyone is applying to those schools.
Last question, just because it's a great one. Promise. Does
Okay.
going to a competitive school's summer program improve a student's chance of getting admitted to that school?
It depends on what the program is. So for students, some of the programs, it does help. So for example, some of the Wharton programs, Leadership in the Business World, which are very competitive to get in, uh, we've often seen that students that get into that and make that first bar to get into the summer program end up also getting into Wharton if they end up applying there. Some of the talent-based programs also, if you do like a films program at USC, that can help because you have interaction with professors who are going to be reading your or looking at your portfolio, and they know you, and so they'll know. We've seen students who have been able to get in. But if it's just a program that is at a particular school and maybe not run by that school, or there's no real bar to get in, then it doesn't really make a difference. It does help you insofar as you can talk about, although this year it's probably gonna be virtual, but in the past when you could go in person, you could talk about why you liked the school because you were at the summer program and what you learned from it. All right, great. So I do have a list of resources, and if anybody is interested, let me think. I will send it to Dory, and she can give it to anyone who's interested in the list of resources. And we also have a newsletter, so you could sign up for that on our website if you want to. And we do a monthly newsletter with information. All right. Thank you so much for coming. Hope you guys learned something and had a good evening. Appreciate it. Bye.